The Nile was already ancient when the pyramids were new. That is not a metaphor. By the time the Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2560 BCE, Egyptian civilization had already been functioning for more than 5 centuries. The administration that organized tens of thousands of workers, the scribal systems that tracked their grain rations, the temple networks that stored the surplus, and the legal framework that resolved disputes between workers and overseers had all been running, evolving, and expanding for generations before the first stone was dragged into place at Giza. What was built in Egypt was not just in stone. It was in procedure, in institution, in accumulated knowledge. This is the world you are about to enter, not the world of pharaohs and gold masks, not the world of curses and mystery, the world of the people who made everything work. Stand at the edge of the Nile at the start of the inundation season, sometime in the New Kingdom period, roughly 1300 BCE. The river is rising. It has been rising for weeks. The water is not clear. It is dark red-brown, carrying the fine sediment of the Ethiopian highlands downstream through thousands of miles of valley and desert. Every field within reach of the flood is being covered, slowly and methodically, by the richest agricultural soil on the planet. The farmers, watching from slightly higher ground, are not afraid. They are assessing. They have been calibrating their entire working lives to this moment, and their fathers and grandfathers calibrated their lives to the same moment before them. The ancient Egyptians called the fertile corridor Kemet, meaning the black land, named for the dark silt the river deposited every year. They called the surrounding desert Deshret, the red land. Everything that sustained human life came from the narrow ribbon of Kemet. Everything that threatened it came from Deshret. The civilization that arose along that ribbon was not the product of divine inspiration or mysterious ancient knowledge. It was the product of 10,000 seasons of observation, physical experience, practical adjustment, and institutional memory passed from generation to generation through formal education, apprenticeship, and bureaucratic record-keeping. The Nile inundation divided the Egyptian year into 3 seasons. Akhet was the flood season, when the river rose over its banks and covered the fields with water and silt. Peret was the planting and growing season, when crops were sown into the newly enriched earth as the waters receded. Shemu was the harvest season, when grain was cut, threshed, measured on official scales, and stored in granaries that were themselves administered by state scribes. Every institution in Egyptian life was synchronized to this agricultural cycle. Tax collection happened immediately after the harvest, when grain was most abundant and easily assessed. Major state construction projects, including pyramid building, temple construction, and canal digging, were organized primarily during the flood season, when agricultural laborers were unavailable for field work and could be redirected to state labor without disrupting the food supply. Religious festivals clustered around the seasonal transitions, marking the flood's arrival, the planting's beginning, and the harvest's completion. The calendar was not a cultural artifact created for aesthetic purposes. It was an operating schedule for a civilization entirely dependent on one river. The tool Egyptians used to monitor the flood was called a nilometer. These were stone columns or staircases cut directly into bedrock and positioned at key points along the river, most notably at the island of Elephantine near Aswan, to track the water's rise and fall through marked measurement intervals. The ideal inundation height at Aswan was considered to be approximately 24 cubits, roughly 12.5 meters. A flood that fell short of that height meant insufficient soil coverage across the agricultural fields and a predictably reduced harvest, triggering contingency planning for food distribution. A flood that rose significantly beyond it destroyed dikes and embankments built to protect villages, inundated stored grain in low-lying granaries, and disrupted the entire agricultural infrastructure. The difference of a single cubit in flood height could mean the practical difference between regional abundance and famine, and the scribes, stationed at nilometers, sent their readings upriver and downriver along an administrative communication network that allowed planning officials to begin calculating expected tax yields and grain reserves months before a single grain of wheat was harvested. That is a bureaucratic achievement of the first order. That is a civilization that had figured out how to transform a river's unpredictable annual behavior into a planning tool with enough predictive precision to feed millions of people across thousands of kilometers of river valley with remarkable consistency across 3,000 years. Now here is the detail that fundamentally resets the mental picture most people carry of ancient Egypt. The people managing these systems were not a mysterious priestly elite operating in esoteric isolation from ordinary life. They were professionals. They had been trained in specific schools attached to temples and royal administrative centers. They had supervisors who reviewed their calculations. They submitted written reports upward through a hierarchical administrative chain that stretched from village-level scribes recording local grain measurements all the way to the vizier's central office in the capital city. Egypt ran on paperwork. Specifically, it ran on papyrus, the reed paper product that Egypt mass-produced from the abundant papyrus plants growing in the Nile marshes and used for every conceivable administrative, legal, literary, medical, and religious purpose. Egypt's administrative output in surviving papyrus documents is so voluminous that entire archives of individual scribal offices have survived essentially intact, giving modern historians an extraordinarily direct window into the bureaucratic and daily life of a civilization operating more than 3,000 years ago. The scribal schools where this administrative expertise was produced were attached to temples and royal administrative centers. Young students, primarily boys from the families of existing scribes and officials, entered these schools around the age of 10 and spent years copying model texts. The curriculum included administrative correspondence templates, legal formulas used in court proceedings, hymns to major deities, medical and technical reference texts, and collections of wisdom literature designed simultaneously to teach literacy and to instill correct professional conduct. A model letter collection called the Kemet was used in Egyptian scribal education for hundreds of years. It begins with formal greeting formulas and moves through standard administrative language, imprinting the conventions of official correspondence on students through repetitive copying. The profession of scribe was the single most reliable ladder into every other administrative, priestly, judicial, and military leadership role in Egyptian society, and Egyptian literature reflects this status in texts that celebrate scribal life with a fervor that borders on propaganda. The Satire of the Trades, one of the most copied texts in Egyptian schooling, describes in vivid, unflattering detail the physical miseries of every non-scribal occupation. The farmer sweats in the mud and loses his crops to insects and floods. The carpenter's back breaks from constant bending. The potter crawls in the dirt among pigs. The soldier is sent to foreign deserts to die in campaigns far from home. The washerman handles other people's filth. The sandal maker reeks of leather and sweat. Only the scribe, the text concludes, sits in shade, eats well, gives orders rather than receiving them, and is remembered after death through the texts he leaves behind. Whether or not Egyptian scribes fully believed this, they copied the text generation after generation, embedding in their own professional culture a self-conception as the essential operators of civilization. Enter the city. Any major New Kingdom city would serve as a starting point, but take Thebes, known to the Egyptians as Waset, the city of the god Amun and the administrative capital of Upper Egypt, for much of the New Kingdom period. Thebes today is the site of modern Luxor, and the ruins of Karnak and Luxor temples are still physically present on the east bank of the Nile. But in 1300 BCE, Thebes was one of the largest and most complex urban environments on Earth, with a population that estimates place between 80,000 and 200,000 people within the city and its immediately surrounding districts. making it comparable to the largest cities of the contemporary ancient world. You enter from the river. Every major Egyptian city oriented its most significant public face toward the Nile because the river was the highway, the trade route, the water supply, and the symbolic axis of Egyptian civilization. The docks of Thebes were crowded and noisy. Wooden boats of varying sizes were moored along a stone quay, some unloading grain sacks brought from estates to the south, some discharging copper ingots from the mines of Sinai, some carrying Nubian gold and exotic goods from the long-distance trade routes that reached deep into sub-Saharan Africa. Workers moved cargo along the quay on wooden sledges and their own backs, directed by supervisors holding wooden counting staffs and maintaining tally records on ostraca. The noise was substantial. The creak of rope against timber, the calls of dock supervisors, the sounds of livestock being led off cargo vessels, and beneath all of it, the constant movement of the river itself. Move inland from the dock, and you enter the street network. Egyptian residential streets were narrow, rarely more than 2 or 3 meters wide in the densest districts, their surfaces hard-packed earth covered in the accumulated debris of daily life. The buildings on either side were mud brick, 2 to 3 stories in the denser urban districts, whitewashed on the exterior and often decorated with painted borders around doorways and windows. Windows were small openings positioned near the top of walls, oriented to catch the north wind that provided natural ventilation and cross-flow cooling through the building's interior. The upper floors had wooden latticed openings that allowed air movement while blocking direct sunlight. This was not primitive construction improvised from whatever materials were available. It was a refined architectural system developed over centuries of practical experience with the specific conditions of desert life that solved the core engineering problem of keeping people reasonably comfortable in an environment that regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. But here is the detail that almost nobody mentions when they describe ancient Egyptian cities. The streets were not quiet, contemplative passages between monumental structures. They were working surfaces covered in the evidence of continuous daily activity. Craft production happened directly in the doorways and open courtyards that opened onto the street. A carpenter's sawdust mixed with the droppings of the donkeys that served as the primary urban transport animal. A potter's kiln smoke drifted across a narrow lane where a bread seller had arranged the morning's loaves on woven reed mats. Geese, goats, and dogs moved through the gaps between loaded carts. Vendors called out their goods from fixed positions along the street. The city smelled of animal, cooking food, river mud, burning dung fuel, and the particular mineral smell of dried mud brick in the sun. It was entirely, relentlessly alive in ways that the monumental stone images of Egypt and the clean museum reconstructions do not capture. The residential quarter was organized loosely by occupation and social tier, rather than by any formal planning system. Elite households clustered in proximity to the temple complexes and administrative offices where political and economic power was concentrated, because physical proximity to power was professionally and socially significant. Craftsmen employed in temple workshops lived in standardized housing provided by the temple estate as part of their compensation package. Farmers who came to the city for seasonal wage labor, or who had been displaced from their land by debt or flood, lived in the rougher districts near the docks, in conditions that surviving textual evidence describes as crowded. The city had no formal zoning designations in the modern sense, but it had a deeply functional social geography that every resident navigated through daily experience and inherited knowledge. At the center of every major Egyptian city was the temple. Not one temple, usually, but a complex of temple structures built across generations and representing different deities, different periods of construction, and different expressions of royal and priestly patronage, all surrounded by a massive enclosure wall of mud brick and connected by ritual processional avenues lined with carved stone sphinxes. Karnak Temple at Thebes was not a single building. It was a city within a city, constructed, expanded, rebuilt, and modified over nearly 2,000 continuous years of Egyptian history, from the Middle Kingdom through the Greek and Roman periods. At its New Kingdom peak, the Karnak temple complex owned agricultural estates distributed across multiple provinces, maintained workshops producing linen, jewelry, leather goods, and processed food, employed an estimated 80,000 people across all its functions, including priests, administrators, farmers, craftsmen, and servants, and managed a distribution system that took in agricultural surplus from its estates and redistributed it as salaries and rations to its personnel. 80,000 people whose names, rations, duties, and status changes were tracked by temple administrative scribes. That is an institution of bureaucratic complexity that very few ancient organizations could match. Walk through the pylon gateway of a major New Kingdom temple. The pylon is a massive trapezoidal gateway structure, the largest examples reaching over 40 meters in height, with its outer surfaces originally covered in brightly painted relief carvings and hung with tall cedar flagpoles rising above the roofline. Their bright linen pennants visible from across the Nile and from the rooftops of the city. The gateway opens into a large public courtyard, a space where ordinary Egyptians could gather on festival days and witness portions of the religious ceremonies being conducted inside. Beyond a second gateway, the visitor enters the hypostyle hall, a forest of enormous stone columns, their surfaces covered entirely in painted raised relief carvings. The hypostyle hall at Karnak contains 134 columns arranged in 16 rows. The central aisle columns are 21 meters tall and 10 meters in circumference. Walking through the hall without lighting feels like entering geological space. The stone is everywhere, carved, painted, ancient, and immense. Beyond the hypostyle hall, the temple narrows into increasingly restricted zones. A third gateway, then a sequence of smaller halls, each accessible to a smaller number of people, leads eventually to the inner sanctuary, a stone chamber housing the gilded wooden cabinet in which the god's statue resided. This was not a symbolic dwelling. In Egyptian theology, the divine statue was literally inhabited by the god when properly activated through ritual. The sanctuary was the physical location of the deity's presence in the world. Now watch what happens inside that sanctuary when you examine the daily operations closely. Every morning before dawn, a senior priest breaks the clay seal placed on the sanctuary door the previous evening, enters the dark interior with a lit oil lamp, and begins a precise sequence of ritual actions that has been performed in some form every day for hundreds of years. He approaches the cabinet housing the deity, opens it, and begins the daily care of the divine statue. The statue's clothing from the previous day is removed. The statue's surface is cleaned with water and natron. It is anointed with perfumed oil, dressed in fresh white linen, fitted with specific ritual jewelry and regalia, and presented with food offerings arranged on offering tables before the cabinet. Bread in specific prescribed quantities, beer in specific vessel types, cuts of meat, bundles of vegetables, bundles of dried herbs, jars of oil, and small cakes made to specific ritual recipes. The offering ritual is accompanied by recitation of specific texts from memory by trained priest chanters. The whole procedure is performed 3 times daily, at dawn, at midday, and in the evening. It requires a roster of trained practitioners working in rotating monthly cycles, significant material resources delivered daily from temple stores, and the maintenance of the full priestly administrative infrastructure that manages all of it. But here is the detail that transforms the picture completely. After each ritual presentation of food to the deity, those offerings are removed from the sanctuary and redistributed to temple personnel as part of their daily compensation. The sacred food that has been presented before the god and fulfilled its ritual function is called the reversion of offerings, and it moves outward from the sanctuary through a structured allocation system that functions as the temple's payroll mechanism. Senior priests receive larger allocations corresponding to their status. Junior priests and temple attendants receive smaller portions. Administrative staff, craftsmen employed in temple workshops, and service workers all receive their daily food allocation from the reversion system. The temple economy is a closed loop. Agricultural production on temple estates generates grain, meat, and produce, which flows into the temple as raw materials, is processed into ritual quality food by temple production staff, is presented to the deity as sacred offering, and is returned to the human economy as daily salary for the institution's personnel. No coinage changes hands, no external market is required. The sacred economy is a real, functioning economy. Now leave the temple precinct and enter a home. The village of Deir el-Medina, carved into a dry desert valley on the west bank of Thebes in the hills above the agricultural plain, is one of the most intensively documented settlements in the ancient world. The village was purpose-built by the Egyptian state to house the specialist craftsmen, artists, and their families who were responsible for cutting the rock-hewn corridors of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings on the far side of the ridge, and for painting and decorating those corridors with the elaborate religious texts and images the kings believed necessary for their successful passage into the afterlife. The village was inhabited for approximately 4 centuries, from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, covering the entire New Kingdom period. The dry desert environment preserved an extraordinary quantity of written material. Ostraca, the pottery fragments, and limestone chips used as scratch paper by workers and scribes survive by the tens of thousands from Deir el-Medina alone, documenting the daily life of this community in a level of detail that has no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. A house in Deir el-Medina occupied a long, narrow walled plot, averaging roughly 5 meters in width and 18 meters in depth. The entrance from the street led directly into the front room, a multi-purpose space with a low mud brick platform along one wall that served as seating for guests, a work surface, and a sleeping place for family members or visitors. A small niche in the front room wall held a household deity figure. The ceiling of this room was sometimes slightly higher than the rooms behind it, allowing clerestory ventilation openings near the roofline. Behind the front room was the main living area, slightly below floor level, which served as the primary sleeping space for the household. This room almost invariably contained a painted limestone stela on a dedicated niche or stand, depicting protective household deities such as Bez, Taweret, and the household's personal patron deity, typically accompanied by small clay or faience figurines of those deities. These household shrines were not casual decorations. They were the center of the domestic religious practice that protected the family from illness, difficult childbirth, nightmares, scorpions, and the various other dangers that daily desert life presented. Behind the living room were the kitchen and storage areas, often with a small underground cellar for cooler storage of perishable goods, accessible through a trapdoor in the floor. The roof was reached by external stairs and was used for sleeping in summer, for drying food, for weaving and textile work that benefited from open-air light, and for additional cooking during the hottest months when interior fires were unbearable. The total interior living area of a Deir el-Medina house ranged from approximately 50 to 100 square meters, housing families of 5 to 8 people, with some extended family members in many cases. The beds inside were wooden frames, strung with interwoven cord or strips of leather, elevated off the ground surface to improve air circulation around sleeping occupants and to reduce contact with insects and scorpions that moved along floor level. Instead of pillows, Egyptians used headrests, curved supports carved from wood or shaped from limestone that held the neck elevated during sleep while allowing air to circulate under the head. This arrangement sounds uncomfortable in modern terms, but it was consistent with a culture in which linen headcloths, elaborate wigs, and careful attention to hairstyling made a flat pillow that would flatten and disarrange such grooming impractical. Clothing was stored folded in wooden chests, raised off the ground. Water for daily use was kept in large, porous clay jars on stands that allowed evaporative cooling through the vessel walls, keeping the interior contents measurably cooler than ambient air temperature. Lighting was provided by small clay lamps with pinched spouts that held a wick of twisted fiber burning in a reservoir of castor oil or animal tallow. And here is where the romantic image of ancient Egyptian domestic life requires the most significant correction. An interior space of 50 to 100 square meters, housing 5 to 8 people, lit by 2 or 3 small oil lamps, without a chimney or flue for cooking smoke, with cooking fires burned either on the roof or in the rear of the house, meant that daily life inside an Egyptian home was lived in low light, in close proximity to other family members, and in the persistent presence of smoke. Paleopathological analysis of mummified human remains from ancient Egypt consistently shows evidence of respiratory conditions consistent with chronic smoke inhalation, thickened pleural tissue, inflammation of the lung surfaces, and evidence of chronic bronchitis in mummies from multiple sites and social levels. Eye infections caused by dust, smoke, and the abundant insect life of the Nile environment were endemic throughout Egyptian history. Eye disease is one of the most frequently treated conditions in the Egyptian medical papyri, and multiple prescription types exist for different categories of eye inflammation and infection. The average lifespan of an ordinary working Egyptian was probably between 35 and 45 years, with significant variation by social class, gender, and access to food security. Infant and child mortality was high by modern standards but appears to have been lower than in many contemporary societies, reflecting the generally adequate caloric availability in normal years. Adults who survived childhood could reach old age, and mummies of individuals who lived into their 60s and beyond are known, including several pharaohs. But the skeletal evidence from cemeteries of working-class and agricultural Egyptians consistently shows substantial physical wear accumulated by early middle age, arthritic joint disease in the spine, hips, and knees, consistent with years of heavy physical labor and load carrying, dental wear from the grit that contaminated stone-ground grain flour and produced tooth surface erosion at early ages, and evidence of multiple injury events healed through the body's natural processes. The physical experience of Egyptian life was not the tranquil, beautifully decorated existence visible in tomb paintings. Tomb paintings depicted the ideal life the deceased hoped to enjoy in the afterlife, a life of supervised plenty, of pleasant work in beautiful fields, of eternal feasting with family. The actual daily experience of the people who produced those paintings was considerably harder. Step into the kitchen and understand what they were eating. Egyptian food culture was sophisticated, varied, and deeply practical in its organization, and the foundation of the diet at every social level was bread and beer. But describing it that simply vastly understates the variety and cultural significance embedded in those two categories. Egyptian bakers produced more than 40 distinct varieties of bread that are documented in texts and archaeological remains. Each variety was identified by a specific name corresponding to its shape, its grain composition, its enriching additions, or the mold in which it was formed during baking. Round discs baked directly on flat heated stones. Tall conical loaves rising from cylindrical clay molds that are found by the thousands at excavation sites of bakeries, households, and temples. Triangular loaves, spiral-wrapped loaves, small rolls, large flat circles. Breads enriched with dates, with honey, with rendered fat, with sesame, with carob. Breads made from emmer wheat, from barley, from spelt, from mixtures of grains. The variety reflected both the sophistication of Egyptian baking tradition and the multi-purpose economic role that bread played in the civilization. Bread was a daily food consumed at every meal. It was also a ration commodity, distributed as worker compensation, measured and recorded by scribes. It was a ritual offering placed before deity, statues, in temples and in the niches of private tombs. It was left with the dead as provisions for the afterlife. It was used as a unit of informal exchange in local markets. No single item captures the character of Egyptian economic and religious life more completely than bread. Beer was bread's inseparable partner. Egyptian beer was not the clear, carbonated, low-alcohol product of modern industrial brewing. It was a thick, nutritious, slightly sour fermented grain drink, typically brewed from emmer wheat or barley, sometimes flavored with dates, honey, or aromatic additives including juniper berries, and strained through wicker sieves to remove the grain residue before consumption. It was brewed in large fired clay vessels, stored sealed in clay jars marked with the batch contents and quantity, and consumed as a daily dietary staple at every social level, from the agricultural worker to the royal court. Egyptian beer was calorie-dense and provided significant nutritional value, including B vitamins and proteins from the brewing process that complemented the grain-heavy diet. Workers at state labor sites received daily beer rations measured in standard volume units alongside their grain rations. The ration records preserved from the Deir el-Medina community are specific to a degree that allows modern researchers to calculate the caloric intake of individual workers on individual days. Here is a number that tends to fundamentally reframe the popular image of Egyptian pyramid construction. The workers' village excavated at Giza by archaeologist Mark Lehner and his team from the 1990s onward revealed a purpose-built settlement with organized barrack-style housing blocks, a centralized industrial-scale bakery complex capable of producing bread in quantities far exceeding the needs of a small workforce, and a butchery and meat processing facility that handled the slaughter and distribution of large animals. The bone assemblage from the butchery area has been analyzed in detail. Based on the volume of cattle, sheep, and goat bones recovered and the estimated processing rates, the Giza construction site, during active building phases, was consuming approximately 11 cattle and 33 sheep or goats per day as protein supplements for the workforce. 11 cattle per day represents a significant state investment in worker nutrition that far exceeds the minimum necessary to maintain basic physical function. The workers' cemetery adjacent to the settlement, found by accident during construction work in 1990, contains burials that provide direct physical evidence of the workforce's living and working conditions. The bones show evidence of multiple healed fractures, consistent with the kind of traumatic injuries that construction work produces. They also show evidence of medical intervention in some of those cases, fractures that were set and stabilized, allowing healing in anatomically correct alignment, rather than the irregular healing seen when injuries are left untreated. These workers received medical care when injured. This was not a slave camp, organized through terror and starvation. It was a managed professional workforce, operating within the state corvée labor system, fed adequately, housed purposefully, compensated in goods, and provided with medical support when injured. The image of the whip-driven slave laborer that entered popular culture through classical Greek sources was amplified by centuries of Western artistic and religious tradition, and was reinforced by generations of popular entertainment, does not match the physical and documentary evidence that systematic excavation has produced over the past century. Egyptian workers building state monuments were Egyptian citizens fulfilling their obligatory labor contribution to the state, and the state fed them well enough to sustain the decades-long construction projects that the monuments required. The grain those workers consumed arrived from agricultural estates distributed across the Nile Valley, transported to the construction sites by the boat traffic that moved continuously along the river. Egyptian distribution operated through a system that had no coined currency of any kind, but had very precise and consistently applied ideas about relative value and equivalency. The basic unit of account was the deben, a copper weight standard of approximately 91 grams that served as a reference for valuing all other goods. Transactions were not conducted in physical deben weights in most circumstances. Instead, goods were exchanged at their agreed deben equivalent values, and the terms of significant transactions were recorded on ostraca or papyrus documents that could be produced as evidence in legal disputes. A pair of basic sandals was valued at approximately 1 deben of copper. A standard quality pig was worth 5 deben. A decorated wooden storage chest was worth between 20 and 25 deben. High-quality linen, gold jewelry, and imported luxury items carried higher valuations. Grain prices fluctuated seasonally and in response to harvest quality, and the price records from Deir el-Medina show consistent tracking of grain values across years, indicating that workers were aware of and responding to market fluctuations when making exchange decisions. That is a functioning market economy operating without currency, sustained by a culture of valuation, negotiation, and recorded agreement that had been operating for centuries. The river made all of it possible. Wooden boats, ranging from small papyrus bundle skiffs, capable of carrying a few hundred kilograms, to large cargo vessels called canoe, capable of transporting multi-ton loads of grain, stone, timber, or metal, moved continuously along the Nile in both directions. Sailing south against the current was made consistently possible by the reliable north wind that blows up the Nile Valley from the Mediterranean for most of the year, driven by the thermal dynamics of the Sahara to the south. Sailing north was accomplished by lowering the sail and using the river's current alone. The Egyptians recognized this geographic gift explicitly in their writing system. The hieroglyphic sign for the verb to travel south showed a boat with its sail raised. The sign for to travel north showed a boat with the sail furled and lowered. The entire distribution infrastructure of Egyptian civilization, the movement of grain, metal, stone, linen, food, and people across the 2,000-kilometer length of the Nile Valley, was built on this reliable alternating transport system. Egyptian trade extended well beyond the internal distribution network of the Nile Valley. To the northeast, Egyptian state expeditions and private merchants traveled into the Sinai Peninsula for copper ore and turquoise, and into the Levant for cedar timber from the mountains of Lebanon, olive oil, wine, and resin products that Egypt either could not produce locally or could not produce in sufficient quantity. To the south, Nubia represented the primary source of gold for the Egyptian economy, along with ivory carved from elephant tusks, ebony wood, animal skins, and enslaved people obtained through both tribute systems and direct trade. To the southeast, expeditions sent to a land the Egyptians called Punt, believed by modern researchers to have been located somewhere along the coasts of modern Eritrea, northern Somalia, or southern Yemen, returned with myrrh trees, frankincense, resin, ebony, gold, animal skins, live exotic animals including baboons, and other luxury goods that had no Egyptian equivalent. The expedition sent by Queen Hatshepsut to Punt around 1470 BCE is documented in extraordinary detail by the carved relief program at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari on the west bank of Thebes. The carvings show Egyptian sailing vessels navigating open water, the distinctive landscape of Punt with its unusual round houses elevated on stilts, the interaction between Egyptian officials and the Queen of Punt and her attendants, the loading of goods, including live myrrh trees, transported with their root systems wrapped in baskets for replanting in Egyptian temple gardens, the weighing of incense resins on official scales before Egyptian scribes, and the return journey to Thebes with the cargo holds full. The scene includes depictions of the distinctive fish, plants, and marine creatures of the Punt coastal environment, rendered with enough biological specificity to assist modern researchers in narrowing the geographic identification. It is one of the earliest detailed documentary records of a long-distance maritime trade expedition in human history. The military dimension of Egyptian civilization also shaped the daily life of ordinary people in ways that go beyond the battlefield. Egypt maintained a professional military force supported by the state, including infantry, chariot corps, and naval units, and supplemented it with foreign mercenary contingents from Nubia, Libya, and the Aegean region. The Nubian Medjay, originally a semi-nomadic people from the eastern desert regions of Nubia, became a standard component of Egyptian security forces and eventually gave their name to the general category of police and security personnel in Egyptian administrative language. Military service offered a path upward for men of limited background, with successful soldiers receiving grants of agricultural land as reward for battlefield performance, documented in New Kingdom military records and commemorative inscriptions. The military payroll, the distribution of rations to soldiers in garrison and campaign, and the management of military supply logistics were all handled through the same scribal administrative systems that managed agricultural and temple finance. War, like agriculture and religion, was ultimately an administrative enterprise. Now step outside the trade lanes and enter the religious calendar. Egyptian religion was not a separate sphere of life, sequestered from daily activity and economic function. It was the overarching framework through which all daily activity was understood, organized, and given meaning. The gods were not remote beings approached only in the restricted inner sanctuaries of great temples. They were understood as active presences in the world whose moods and favor shaped the quality of the Nile flood, the success of harvests, the outcome of legal disputes, the safety of women in childbirth, and the experience of dreams. At the personal and household level, Egyptian religious practice centered on small household shrines, offerings of food and flowers left at neighborhood wayside deity chapels, the consultation of dream interpretation specialists, the wearing of protective amulets on the body at all times, and the use of magical words and actions to address daily problems, from toothaches to snake bites to the behavioral problems of difficult children. The amulet culture of ancient Egypt was not peripheral superstition attached to the edges of a rational civilization. It was a systematic practice embedded in the Egyptian understanding of how the world worked. Amulets carved from specific stones or faience in specific shapes were believed to carry specific protective powers. The Djed pillar represented stability, the Ankh represented life. The Eye of Horus represented protection and healing. The scarab represented regeneration and transformation. These objects were worn on the body by people of every social level, from agricultural workers to royal family members. They were placed on mummified bodies at burial, in specific anatomical positions corresponding to the body part each amulet protected. They were given as gifts to mark significant life transitions. The production of amulets was a significant craft industry, and workshops producing faience amulets in large quantities have been found at multiple New Kingdom sites. The major festivals were the most significant public religious events of the Egyptian year and functioned simultaneously as religious ceremonies, political demonstrations of royal divine authority, and large-scale social redistributive events. The Opet festival at Thebes, celebrated annually in the second month of the Akhet flood season, lasted 27 days in its full New Kingdom form. During Opet, the statues of the triad of deities worshipped at Karnak, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were removed from their inner sanctuaries, placed in their portable gilded wooden bark shrines, carried out of the temple on the shoulders of rows of priests, loaded onto large decorated sacred river barks moored at the temple quay, and transported upstream along the Nile to Luxor Temple. The processional route was lined with crowds of ordinary Theban residents who had gathered to witness the divine journey. Temple administrative records indicate that food and beer were distributed to the population from temple storehouses throughout the festival period. 27 days of public distribution to the city and district of Thebes represented a significant economic transfer from the temple institution to the surrounding civilian population. The festival was simultaneously a theological ceremony, confirming the pharaoh's divine relationship with Amun, a political spectacle demonstrating royal and priestly power to the assembled city, and a genuine material benefit distributed to the people who attended. The beautiful Feast of the Valley, another major Theban festival, involved the divine barks crossing the Nile to the west bank, where Egyptians visited and made offerings at the tombs of their ancestors. Spending the night in the necropolis, in a combination of funerary, ritual, and family reunion that has no precise modern equivalent. Food, flowers, and music were part of these all-night necropolis celebrations. The line between the living and the dead in Egyptian practice was permeable and actively maintained through regular ritual attention. The oracle system was where institutional religion met individual, practical need in its most direct and democratic form. When an ordinary Egyptian had a legal or personal dispute they could not resolve through the local village council, or wanted to identify which of several suspects had stolen goods from them, or needed guidance on a consequential personal decision, they could appeal to the god's oracle during a public festival procession. The procedure was straightforward in practice, if complex in theology. A petitioner would approach the processional route carrying two written statements on separate pieces of ostrakon or papyrus, each representing one possible answer to their question. As the divine bark was carried past on the shoulders of the priests, the petitioner would present both options. The movement of the bark, tilting forward toward one option or drawing back from it, constituted the divine answer. In yes or no cases, forward movement indicated affirmation and backward movement indicated negation. The oracle's response was legally recognized and could be submitted as evidence in court proceedings. Surviving papyri from Deir el-Medina record specific oracle cases. A worker asking the oracle whether a named individual stole a specific tool from him, the oracle responding affirmatively, and that response being used in the subsequent Kenbet court proceeding against the accused. The system provided ordinary Egyptians with access to a form of divine arbitration that operated outside the formal court structure and could both supplement and compete with it. The formal judicial structure was the Kenbet, a council of senior community members, including officials, priests, and experienced local administrators, who convened periodically to hear cases presented by community members. The Kenbet had the authority to hear evidence, question witnesses, examine written documents submitted as proof, and render decisions that were recorded and legally binding. The Kenbet's jurisdiction at Deir el-Medina covered the full range of disputes arising in a community of a few hundred households: theft of tools or food, property boundary disputes, unpaid debts and wages, accusations of adultery, and divorce proceedings. All of these are documented in the Deir el-Medina Ostraka archive. Women appear in the Kenbet records as fully active legal participants. Women filed cases as plaintiffs, gave testimony as witnesses, submitted written property documents as evidence, and appeared as defendants. A New Kingdom Egyptian woman could own land and other real property in her own name, inherit equally with male siblings under the standard Egyptian inheritance system, lend money at interest, and recover the debt through legal action, enter into commercial and rental contracts, and initiate divorce proceedings against a husband without requiring a male relative to act as her legal representative. These rights were not theoretical or rarely exercised. The Deir el-Medina documents show women actively using all of them in the course of ordinary community life. The degree of female legal agency that Egyptian New Kingdom society provided was exceptional in the ancient world, significantly exceeding the legal status of women in contemporary Mesopotamian, Levantine, Greek, and Roman societies. The most extensively documented single legal case from Deir el-Medina involves a man named Paneb, who rose to the position of gang foreman on one of the tomb construction crews and was subsequently accused before the vizier himself, the highest judicial officer in Egypt below the pharaoh, of a long catalogue of offences. The charges included misappropriating stone from the royal tomb construction site for his own use, physically assaulting multiple persons, including his own foreman, bribing an official to secure his appointment as foreman, and various other abuses of his position. The charges were detailed and specific, naming the individuals involved, describing the locations and circumstances of each offence, and providing witness names. An investigation was conducted at the level of the vizier's office. The documents recording this investigation survive and provide a remarkable window into how the Egyptian administrative judicial system handled serious misconduct by a middle-level official. Whatever the final resolution of the Paneb case, which the surviving records do not make entirely clear, the existence of the investigation itself demonstrates that ordinary people in Egyptian society could bring specific complaints against officials of higher social status and receive formal administrative attention. The social stratification of Egyptian society is worth examining in detail because it operated on more subtle gradations than the simple division between pharaoh and worker that popular accounts suggest. Egyptian society had a genuine intermediate tier of skilled professionals, minor officials, specialist craftsmen, and lower-ranking priests who occupied a middle position between the elite administrative class and the agricultural labor majority. This middle tier was the civilization's operational layer, the people who translated the decisions of the elite into physical action by coordinating the actual work. A senior scribe attached to a major temple or the vizier's office might supervise a staff of junior scribes, manage a portfolio of property and resource accounts, correspond with officials across multiple provinces, and exercise significant local authority over the people and resources within their administrative domain. They would own a substantial house in a good district, commission a properly decorated tomb in a good location in the necropolis, own furniture of some quality, and provide their family with linen clothing of the finer grades that distinguished social status in a culture where cloth quality was a primary visible marker of social position. They were not the elite. They were not poor. They were the competent middle of a large organization, and their professional stability depended on maintaining productive relationships with the officials above them and the workers below them. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina occupied a similar middle position, though one defined more by specialized skill than by formal administrative authority. The men who cut and painted the royal tombs were professionals of the first rank. Their technical knowledge was unique and irreplaceable. They knew the specific measurements, proportions, and painting conventions that governed royal tomb decoration. They knew the religious texts that were required in each zone of the tomb corridor. They understood stone-cutting techniques that could produce the smooth, precisely angled surfaces required for the highest quality relief carving. This expertise gave them negotiating leverage with the state that ordinary agricultural workers did not possess. When the Deir el-Medina workers went on strike, they were not easily replaced with an alternative workforce. The state needed their specific knowledge. That gave their labor action a power that ordinary corvée labor disputes would not have had. The position of Egyptian women within this social structure deserves particular attention because it challenges the assumption, often applied to ancient civilizations generally, that female legal and economic marginalization was universal in the pre-modern world. In Egypt, it was not. The legal rights of Egyptian women were genuinely substantial and were actively exercised throughout the documentary record we possess. But it is equally important not to overstate the case. Egyptian women had strong legal and property rights, but they rarely occupied the formal institutional positions from which those rights were administered. The judges on Kenbet courts were almost invariably male. The The viziers who managed the national administrative apparatus were almost invariably male. The scribes who ran the recording systems were almost invariably male. Women's legal agency operated within an institutional framework designed and operated primarily by men, and while that framework respected female rights to a degree that was exceptional in the ancient world, it did not provide women with equal access to the institutional power that interpreted and enforced those rights. Exceptions existed. Hatshepsut exercised royal power as pharaoh for approximately 20 years in the early New Kingdom. Nefertiti appears in Amarna period imagery in roles that may indicate a degree of co-regency with Akhenaten. The god's wife of Amun, a high priestly title held by royal women in the Third Intermediate Period, carried substantial economic and religious authority at Thebes. But these were exceptions in a system where formal institutional power was structurally concentrated in male hands, even as legal and property rights were extended to women in ways that distinguished Egypt from almost every contemporary civilization. Now, consider what Egyptian society did with its dead. The Egyptian preoccupation with death and the afterlife, which has fascinated external observers since classical antiquity, was not a morbid obsession with mortality but a practical engineering project aimed at solving a problem. The problem was impermanence. The solution was systematic intervention to extend the person's existence beyond physical death into a permanent state that the Egyptians called eternity, nehe, the endless cycling of time in which the dead lived alongside the gods and continued to experience existence in a form purified of the limitations and suffering of earthly life. The first practical requirement for this project was the preservation of the physical body, because the ancient Egyptian understanding of the person was composite. The person consisted of multiple elements: the physical body, the ka, which was the vital animating force, the ba, which was the personality and consciousness that could move between the living world and the afterlife, the ren, which was the name, and whose persistence in memory extended the person's existence, and the aak, which was the transformed eternal being that the properly prepared deceased could become. The preservation of the body was necessary because the ba needed a recognizable physical form to return to. Without a preserved body, the ba could not maintain its connection to a specific person's identity, and the transformation into aha could not be completed. Mummification, in its full New Kingdom form, was a process requiring up to 70 days and involving multiple stages of technical intervention performed by specialist embalmers operating from dedicated embalming workshops near the major necropolises. The internal organs were removed through an incision in the left flank and treated separately. The stomach, liver, intestines, and lungs were preserved individually and placed in 4 specialized containers called canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of the god Horus, and stopped with a lid carved in the form of the protecting deity's head. The heart was left in the body, because the heart was understood as the seat of intelligence and conscience and would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the judgment of the dead. The brain was removed through the nasal passages, using metal tools, and discarded, because the Egyptians did not attribute significant function to the brain and saw it as expendable tissue. The body cavity was packed with natron salt and linen padding to maintain its shape during the desiccation process. Then the entire body was covered in dry natron salt and left for 40 days to complete the dehydration. The dried body was then washed, anointed with resins, oils, and perfumes, wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandaging with specific amulets placed at prescribed anatomical positions within the wrapping layers, fitted with a painted cartonnage mask, and placed in its nested series of wooden coffins. For the elite, this process was accompanied by the production of a Book of the Dead, a personalized collection of spells, protective texts, and illustrated vignettes drawn from an established corpus of funerary literature and customized for the individual purchaser. The Book of the Dead was a luxury product, commissioned from specialist scribes and artists, and priced according to the number of spells included, the quality of the papyrus on which it was written, the quantity and quality of the accompanying illustrations, and the degree of personalization applied through the insertion of the deceased's name into the standard text. A comprehensive, high-quality Book of the Dead could cost the equivalent of several months of a skilled craftsman's wages. The scribal workshops that produced them maintained standard text templates that could be customized at various quality levels for different levels of expenditure, in essentially the same way that modern commercial printing accommodates different budget levels for the same fundamental product. The specific texts in the Book of the Dead were designed to guide the deceased through a sequence of challenges in the afterlife realm, culminating in the Hall of Judgment before Osiris, where the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of Maat on a scale observed by 42 divine assessors. The outcome of this weighing determined the deceased's eligibility for eternal life. A heart heavier than the feather, weighted down by moral failures, would be devoured by the Amit, a composite creature combining the features of a crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, while a heart lighter than, or equal to, the feather allowed passage into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. The Book of the Dead spells included specific formulas that the deceased could recite to influence the weighing favorably, including a spell addressed to the heart itself, commanding it not to testify against its owner. The ordinary Egyptian who could not afford a full Book of the Dead, a decorated tomb with painted walls, multiple coffin layers, and a comprehensive set of funerary equipment, nonetheless attempted to prepare for death with the means available. The minimum requirement was proper wrapping of the body with whatever linen was available, the placement of at least a few protective amulets within the wrapping, the performance of the opening of the mouth ceremony to restore the deceased's senses and ability to receive offerings, and the provision of a modest set of food offerings and symbolic objects. Evidence from cemeteries associated with working-class and agricultural communities shows that even the poorest burials included some intentional care for the deceased. The body was oriented correctly relative to compass points, wrapped, however, roughly, and placed with at least a few objects that suggested concern for the deceased's continued existence. The aspiration for afterlife was not class-specific. The ability to prepare for it adequately was. The tomb painting tradition deserves particular attention because it illuminates the intersection of artistic, religious, and economic systems in Egyptian civilization. Elite private tombs in the Theban necropolis were commissioned by their owners, often during their lifetimes rather than posthumously, and represented substantial investments of resources over years or decades. The tomb owner would engage a team of specialists, rock cutters to excavate the tomb corridor and chamber, plasterers to prepare the wall surfaces, draftsmen to lay out the compositions in preliminary red ochre sketches, senior painters to execute the finished colored scenes, and scribal specialists to write the hieroglyphic captions and religious texts that accompanied the images. The finished tomb was a visual and textual program designed to ensure the owner's successful passage into the afterlife and to maintain their existence in memory through the image record of their life, their titles and achievements, and their proper performance of piety toward the gods and the pharaoh. The scenes depicted in New Kingdom Theban private tomb chapels provide an extraordinary documentary record of Egyptian daily life, precisely because their purpose was to reconstruct the material conditions that the deceased hoped to enjoy forever. The agricultural operations shown in tomb scenes used specific Egyptian tools. The market transactions shown in tomb scenes specify the goods being exchanged and sometimes their values. The craft production scenes show specific tools and techniques. The festival scenes show the music, dance, and food that constituted celebration. The funerary banquet scenes show the types of food, drink, and entertainment that proper hosting required. Because these images were meant to be accurate enough to be magically functional, they carry an evidential weight about actual practice that purely decorative art would not. When a tomb scene at Thebes shows a carpenter using a specific type of adze to shape a wooden plank, we can reasonably infer that that type of adze was actually used for that purpose in New Kingdom Thebes. But here is the detail that the administrative record of Egypt's success also contains. That legal framework and administrative machinery existed within a social system that concentrated power, wealth, and effective institutional protection at the top of the hierarchy in ways that the formal framework of Ma'at, cosmic justice and order, could not entirely correct. The pharaoh was divine by definition and not subject to the accountability mechanisms that governed everyone below him. The vizier who administered justice served at the pharaoh's pleasure and could be replaced if his judgments created political problems. The senior priests, who managed the oracle system that provided divine arbitration to ordinary petitioners, also had their own institutional financial interests in specific outcomes. And when the stated priorities of the state or the institutional interests of the temple collided with the practical needs of individual workers or farming families, the weight of institutional power almost invariably fell on the side of the institution. The most visible evidence of structural stress in the later New Kingdom was the epidemic of tomb robbery that swept through the Theban necropolis and ultimately reached into the royal burials in the Valley of the Kings themselves. The royal tombs had been constructed at enormous cost over generations, cut deep into the limestone hills of the West Bank, sealed, guarded, and surrounded by religious prohibitions and curses intended to be inviolable. They were not. Beginning in the reign of Ramesses IX, around 1110 BCE, and continuing into the Third Intermediate Period, organized gangs systematically looted tomb after tomb, stripping the mummified remains of their gold and jeweled amulets, melting down metal objects for resale, and removing wooden furniture, stone vessels, and other valuables. The investigations that followed produced a set of documents known collectively as the Tomb Robbery Papyri, which record in formal administrative language the examination of suspects, the confessions made under interrogation, the identification of accomplices within the guarding institutions themselves, and the recovery of some stolen materials. The robbery gangs included former construction workers who had detailed knowledge of tomb layouts, copper smelters who could process stolen metal, and corrupt officials who were supposed to be maintaining the guard rotation on the necropolis. The operation required coordination across multiple community levels and was extensive enough to require a formal state investigation involving the vizier's office and multiple interrogation proceedings. The fact that the royal tombs were being robbed systematically, that the robberies involved community-wide participation, including officials, and that the problem was serious enough to require major institutional response indicates a society under significant economic stress. The workers who built the tombs were going unpaid. The officials who guarded them were susceptible to corruption. The institutional compact between the state and the working population was breaking down. The workers who built and decorated the Valley of the Kings' tombs staged what historians believe was the earliest recorded labor strike in human history during the reign of Ramesses III in the mid-12th century BCE. Ration records from Deir el-Medina for this period show workers going months without receiving their full grain allocations, as the state's administrative and fiscal capacity was strained by military pressures on Egypt's borders and internal economic disruption. When the ration shortfalls reached a critical point, the Deir el-Medina workers set down their tools, left the work sites in the Valley of the Kings, and gathered instead at the mortuary temples of the West Bank, refusing to work until their situation was addressed. The records include language that is understood as the workers' direct statement of their position. They were hungry, they had not received what they were owed, and they would not return to work until the situation was corrected. Scribes and officials arrived to negotiate. Partial grain distributions were made from available temple stores. The workers returned to work. But the pattern of delayed or partial rations continued across the late Ramesside period, and the strike was not a single isolated event, but part of a recurring pattern of workers asserting their basic economic rights within a system that was increasingly failing to honor its obligations to them. Egyptian medicine was one of the civilization's most remarkable intellectual and practical achievements, and to understand it accurately requires holding two apparently contradictory things in mind simultaneously, without resolving them into a single, neat narrative. Egyptian medical practitioners operated on genuine empirical observation, accumulated across centuries of clinical practice, and systematically recorded in detailed medical texts that were copied, annotated, and transmitted across generations. They also integrated ritual and magical procedures into virtually every medical intervention they performed. In the Egyptian understanding of the world, these were not contradictory approaches because they addressed different dimensions of the same problem. Illness had a physical cause that required physical treatment. It also had a cosmic dimension, as a disruption of the order that Ma'at maintained, that required ritual address. Treating only one dimension while ignoring the other would be, from the Egyptian perspective, incomplete medicine. The Edwin Smith papyrus, surviving in a copy made around 1600 BCE, but believed to be based on source texts considerably older, possibly from the Old Kingdom period, contains 48 case studies of physical trauma injuries, arranged systematically from head injuries downward through the body. Each case follows a consistent format: a description of the physical examination findings, a diagnosis stated in specific terms, a prognosis expressed as one of 3 standard assessments, and a recommended treatment or the statement that no treatment is possible. The prognosis categories are striking in their clinical directness: an ailment which I will treat, indicating confidence in recovery; an ailment with which I will contend, indicating a difficult case with uncertain outcome; and an ailment not to be treated, indicating a condition beyond the current capacity of medical intervention. The willingness to state clearly that some conditions cannot be treated, rather than offering futile interventions, reflects a clinical culture that valued honest assessment over therapeutic optimism. Case 6 of the Edwin Smith papyrus describes a patient with a compound skull fracture whose brain is visible through the break. The papyrus notes that the patient cannot speak and that their limbs on one side of the body are unable to move. The scribe observes a connection between the head wound and the distant limb dysfunction, and the case receives a prognosis of not to be treated, consistent with the clinical reality that a compound skull fracture with exposed brain tissue and associated paralysis was beyond the effective intervention of ancient medicine. The papyrus uses a specific term for the brain and describes it as having a surface resembling corrugated copper, a description consistent with the visual appearance of cerebral cortex surface tissue. This is not the writing of someone who does not understand the body. This is clinical observation. The Ebers papyrus, dated to roughly the same period in its surviving form, contains over 700 individual prescriptions and treatment protocols covering gastrointestinal conditions, respiratory infections, eye diseases, skin conditions, and parasitic infestations, gynecological conditions, dental pain, cardiovascular symptoms, and mental states. The pharmacological ingredients in these prescriptions include dozens of plant-based substances that modern pharmacological analysis has confirmed to have genuine therapeutic properties. Willow leaves and bark, used repeatedly in the Ebers papyrus for pain and inflammation, contain salicylate compounds chemically related to aspirin. Honey, used extensively for wound treatment, has documented antimicrobial properties resulting from its hydrogen peroxide content and low moisture activity. Garlic appears in multiple preparations and contains allicin, a documented antibacterial compound. Castor oil is used as a laxative, consistent with its genuine pharmaceutical action. Acacia preparations used in gynecological contexts contain tannins with documented medicinal properties. Egyptian medicine also included specialist practitioners in a manner that went beyond the generalist physician. The Sunu, general practitioners whose title appears regularly in administrative records, handled a broad range of medical conditions. Practitioners, specifically designated for eye conditions, appear in both medical texts and administrative records, consistent with the high prevalence of eye disease in the Egyptian environment. Dental practitioners are documented in inscriptions and their interventions visible in the dentition of mummified remains, including evidence of attempted tooth stabilization using gold wire, crude fillings of resinous material in cavity preparations, and a range of tooth extraction cases. A medical specialist, designated the physician of the belly, appears in texts describing practitioners who specialized in abdominal conditions. Workers on the royal tomb construction sites at Deir el-Medina had access to medical personnel whose rations appear alongside those of craftsmen and scribes in the administrative records, indicating that medical care was considered a standard provision for the state workforce. Now the civilization comes into complete view. Egypt was a society of extraordinary institutional density and administrative sophistication, capable of organizing agricultural production across 2,000 kilometers of river valley, managing labor at scales no other ancient civilization matched, transmitting specialized, technical, and intellectual knowledge reliably across many generations through formal educational systems, and maintaining legal and religious frameworks that gave people at multiple social levels meaningful access to both practical justice and spiritual meaning. It was also a society in which all of that organizational sophistication served, ultimately, a hierarchical system in which a narrow elite consumed the majority of the surplus, while the agricultural and craft-working population that produced that surplus lived under conditions that combined adequate provision in good times with acute vulnerability when the system's capacity was strained. The workers who dragged granite blocks at Giza in the flood season, who spent their working days cutting stone corridors through the bedrock of the Valley of the Kings in summer heat, who brewed beer for festival distributions and temple rituals, who copied medical texts in scribal schools and measured nilometer readings at dawn and adjusted irrigation channels and heard disputes in Kenbet courts. All of them lived within a system that was simultaneously one of the most impressive human achievements in history, and a structure that extracted continuous physical cost from the people at its base. The temples were real, the festivals were real, the food was real, the legal system was real. The social pressures, the economic vulnerability, the physical wear of daily labor, and the organizational capacity of the state to extract more than it sometimes returned were also real. Egypt held together, continuously, for over 3,000 years. That is an achievement with no parallel in human history. But the holding together was purchased disproportionately by people whose names survived mostly on broken pottery fragments used as scratch paper. The agricultural system that sustained Egypt's population and generated its surplus requires sustained attention because it was the foundation on which every other achievement was built, and it operated through a set of practical mechanisms that were considerably more complex than the image of farmers simply planting seeds in Nile silt and waiting for harvest implies. Egyptian agriculture was intensively managed through a sophisticated system of irrigation infrastructure that extended the reach of the Nile's annual flood beyond the immediately inundated areas. Basin irrigation, the primary technique used across most of the Nile Valley throughout pharaonic history, worked by constructing a network of earthen embankments that divided the floodplain into a series of large, shallow basins. As the Nile rose during Akhet, water was channeled into these basins through sluice openings in the embankments and held there for 4 to 6 weeks, during which time the silt settled onto the field surface and the soil absorbed the water deeply enough to support crop growth without additional irrigation through the growing season. When the flood began to recede, the residual water in the basins was drained back toward the river, leaving behind a saturated, silt-enriched field surface ready for planting. The management of this basin network required coordinated labor across entire agricultural districts. The embankments had to be maintained, repaired after flood damage, and adjusted as the flood geometry changed from year to year. Sluice openings had to be managed to achieve the correct flood depth in each basin, avoiding both insufficient flooding and the overflooding that could damage embankment structures. The drainage timing had to be coordinated across multiple basins simultaneously to avoid backing up water in connected systems. This coordination was managed by local irrigation officials who had authority over the corvée labor required for embankment maintenance and who reported to provincial governors, who in turn reported upward to the central administration. The irrigation system was not natural. It was institutional infrastructure, requiring continuous administrative management. Beyond the basin system, the Egyptians constructed shadoof lifting devices, simple counterweighted water lifting tools that allowed irrigation of fields above the natural floodline, and in later periods, more complex irrigation technologies were adopted. Gardens attached to elite households and temples required year-round water supply, independent of the flood, and the shadoof provided the mechanism for manually lifting river water into garden irrigation channels across the seasons when the river was at its low stage. Temple gardens cultivated specific plant species required for ritual use, medical applications, and the production of incense and oil, making their year-round irrigation a matter of religious and economic necessity. The grain harvest, when it finally came after months of agricultural work, was processed through a sequence of operations that were themselves institutionally organized and administratively tracked. Workers moved through the fields with curved bronze sickles, cutting the grain stalks close to the ground and bundling them for transport to the threshing floor. The threshing floors were open circular areas of packed earth where the grain bundles were spread and animals, typically cattle, were driven repeatedly across the surface to separate the grain from the chaff through the action of their hooves. The loosened grain was then winnowed by workers who used wooden scoops to toss it into the air so that the lighter chaff blew away on the wind while the heavier grain fell back to the floor. The winnowed grain was then measured in standard volume units using official measuring vessels by state scribes who recorded the yield against the pre-harvest assessment that had been made based on the Nilometer readings and field measurements from earlier in the season. The difference between the assessed yield and the actual yield determined whether the farmer owed additional grain to the state treasury or whether the assessment would be adjusted for the following year. The state grain storage system was geographically distributed across major urban and regional centers in large mud brick granary complexes, the internal chambers of which have been excavated at multiple sites including Amarna, Saqqara, and the Ramesseum mortuary complex at Thebes. The Ramesseum granaries, attached to the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, had a documented storage capacity estimated at sufficient grain to feed approximately 17,000 people for a full year. This was not an abstract reserve. It was the active working capital of the temple institution and the emergency supply system for the surrounding population in the event of harvest failure. The complexity of managing this system, tracking the flow of grain from field assessment through harvest measurement, through regional storage, through distribution to workers, temples, officials, and emergency reserves across multiple provinces and thousands of administrative units, was the primary justification for the existence of the enormous Egyptian scribal bureaucracy. Without scribes at every level of the agricultural system, the surplus could not be tracked, could not be stored against need, and could not be redistributed according to institutional priorities. The scribal profession was not a luxury of Egyptian civilization. It was the essential operating system. And into this world, according to the biblical account, came a people who would carry the memory of Egypt with them for the rest of their civilization's history. The Joseph narrative in Genesis describes a Hebrew slave rising through recognition of his administrative talent to a position of managing the kingdom's grain reserves across a period of anticipated agricultural crisis. overseeing the collection of surplus during 7 productive years to provision the population through 7 years of shortage. The scenario is consistent with what is known of Egyptian administrative practice in substantial detail. Egypt's centralized grain storage system was one of the civilization's defining institutional achievements, and the management of agricultural surplus against the predictable variability of Nile flood conditions was among the most important functions of the pharaonic state. The capacity to identify talented administrators from non-Egyptian backgrounds and elevate them to responsible positions is documented in the historical record. Individuals of Asiatic, Nubian, and Libyan origin appear in New Kingdom administrative contexts with Egyptian titles and responsibilities. A foreign-born individual rising to a position of significant administrative authority within the Egyptian state is not historically implausible. It is historically documented. The conditions described in the Exodus narrative, Israelite laborers working under Egyptian overseers, manufacturing mud bricks to quota requirements, performing forced labor on state construction projects, building supply cities for the pharaonic administration, correspond in their practical details to the Egyptian corvée labor system that built monuments, dug canals, and constructed storage facilities across 3,000 years. New Kingdom administrative papyri from construction sites record the names, ethnic identifications, and daily ration allocations of workers drawn from across the empire and from outside it. Among these workers, individuals identified by the Egyptian term for Asiatics, people from the Levantine and Syro-Palestinian region, appear in multiple construction site records. The presence of Semitic-speaking laborers in Egyptian state labor operations during the New Kingdom period is a fact established by documentary evidence. The sequence of natural disasters described in the Exodus plague narrative follows an ecological progression that corresponds to the known failure modes of the Nile ecosystem in ways that have generated substantial scholarly attention. A disruption to the Nile's normal water chemistry can produce conditions in which the river turns red from algal bloom, disrupting the fish and frog populations in cascading sequence, which in turn produces insect explosions as aquatic predator populations crash, which produces agricultural disruption and livestock disease as the ecosystem imbalance extends outward. The sequence described in Exodus moves from water disruption through biological cascade to atmospheric events and ultimately to mortality. Whether this represents historical memory of an actual catastrophic Nile event, a literary construction using the Nile's known vulnerabilities as its narrative architecture, or some combination of the two, the plague narrative was composed by people who understood the Egyptian Nile ecosystem with the detailed knowledge of people who had lived within it. Moses' upbringing in the pharaoh's household, whatever the precise historical circumstances behind the narrative, would have included exposure to the educational and administrative culture of the Egyptian palace. Egyptian scribal education produced individuals who could manage large groups of people through administrative organization, who understood how to communicate with institutional authority through the formal protocols of official correspondence, who had internalized the legal and ethical frameworks of Egyptian governance, and who possessed the logistical knowledge to manage the movement and provisioning of large populations through difficult terrain. The Exodus figure of Moses demonstrates exactly these capacities: the ability to negotiate repeatedly with a powerful administrative authority, to organize a large mixed population for sustained movement through desert conditions, and to construct legal and ceremonial systems for a newly emerging community. These are the skills of a trained Egyptian administrator applied to a radically different purpose. Egypt was not merely the backdrop to the biblical story. Egypt was the intellectual and administrative school in which the story's central figures were formed, the political structure against which they defined their opposition, and the source of the most foundational memories of bondage, liberation, and the possibility of a different kind of social order that shaped an entire religious tradition. The civilization that built structures still standing after 45 centuries, that organized the first documented labor strike, that maintained medical knowledge systems sophisticated enough to influence later Greek and Roman medicine, that gave women access to property courts and legal standing, that distributed food to its citizens during 27-day public festivals, that tracked the daily grain rations of individual workers by name across 4 centuries of a single village's existence, there was not a mystery. It was not the product of lost technology or forgotten wisdom. It was a human achievement of extraordinary durability, complexity, and consequence, containing within it, as all human achievements do, both magnificent accomplishment and the failures of justice and equity that run through every large human institution. If you walk through the ruins of Karnak today, the columns are still standing, the scale is still overwhelming. In protected corners of certain chambers, traces of the original paint survive. Red ochre, yellow ochre, Egyptian blue, carbon black, applied by the hands of men and women whose names are preserved on ostraca from the village behind the ridge, workers who went on strike when they were not paid, workers who consulted oracles to resolve disputes with their neighbors, workers who prepared their dead with extraordinary care and hope, workers who built something that remained visible for 3,000 years after the last of them was buried. The question worth carrying away from Egypt is not how they built it. It is what the building cost the people who built it, whether the civilization they sustained through that cost was worth what it demanded of them, and what it means that so many of those people, across so many centuries, continued to believe that it was. The question of what Egyptians believed about the gods they served is more subtle than the usual presentation of Egyptian mythology as a fixed system of anthropomorphic deities in fixed relationships with each other. Egyptian theology was, in practice, flexible, syncretic, and responsive to political and historical change in ways that allowed it to absorb new influences, promote new deities to prominence, and demote others without abandoning the overall framework of divine order. The most dramatic example of Egyptian theological flexibility was the Amarna period in the mid-14th century BCE, when the pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who renamed himself Akhenaten, promoted the Aten, the physical disk of the sun, to a position of exclusive divine supremacy and moved the royal capital from Thebes to a newly built city at the site now known as Tel el-Amarna in Middle Egypt. The Aten cult suppressed or diminished the worship of the other major deities, most significantly Amun, whose priests at Karnak represented the wealthiest and most institutionally powerful religious institution in Egypt. Akhenaten's religious reform had significant political dimensions. By elevating the Aten above all other deities, the pharaoh removed the institutional power base of the Amun priesthood and concentrated religious authority directly in the royal household. The experiment lasted approximately 17 years and ended with Akhenaten's death. His successors, including most likely the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun and the general Horemheb, who eventually followed him, systematically reversed the Aten reforms, restored the traditional pantheon, returned the capital to Thebes, and attempted to erase Akhenaten's name from the official record. The Amarna period demonstrates that Egyptian religious institutions were not monolithic or unchanging. They were politically embedded, subject to royal direction, capable of dramatic transformation, and, in the case of the Amarna reversal, capable of being substantially reconstituted after major disruption. The household religious practice that existed alongside the official temple cult had its own dynamic that operated somewhat independently of political changes at the top of the institutional hierarchy. Household shrines, healing shrines at local sanctuary sites, and the consultation of local religious specialists, including dream interpreters and magicians, all provided access to divine intervention that did not require the mediation of the major temple institutions. The textual record from Deir el-Medina includes letters written to the dead, documents composed by the living, and addressed to recently deceased family members, asking them to intervene in ongoing disputes with other family members or neighbors from their new position in the afterlife. These letters were placed at tomb sites or at household shrines and represent a form of religious communication that bypassed both the temple priesthood and the oracle system, addressing divine power through the most intimate available channel, the continued spiritual presence of a known individual. The relationship between Egyptian religion and Egyptian ethics is visible most clearly in the Book of the Dead's negative confession, a list of 42 declarations the deceased was expected to make before the divine assessors in the Hall of Judgment. The negative confession states what the deceased claims not to have done during their earthly life. I have not done wrong. I have not robbed. I have not been violent. I have not killed or ordered killing. I have not defrauded the grain measure. I have not diverted irrigation water from where it belongs. I have not falsely accused anyone. I have not been angry without cause. I have not been deaf to true words. I have not polluted water. I have not reviled the god. The list continues through 42 specific prohibitions. What is remarkable about this list is how thoroughly practical and social it is. The ethical concerns it articulates are almost entirely about treatment of other people and of shared resources. Honesty in commercial dealings, accurate measurement of grain, fair distribution of water, restraint from violence and false accusation. These are the behaviors that Egyptian ethical theology defined as essential to righteous living. That ethical framework was not merely theoretical. It was embedded in the educational curriculum through the wisdom literature that scribal students copied, in the formal statements of officials who described their careers in tomb inscriptions, and in the legal proceedings of the Kenbet courts that evaluated specific behaviors against community standards. The integration of ethical expectation into multiple institutional channels, educational, legal, religious, and commemorative, gave Egyptian moral culture a consistency and persistence that outlasted individual rulers and political upheavals. People could change. The system of expectation remained.